hundreds of Chinese companies that pose threats to national security and violate human rights have entered the U.S. capital market.
You cannot have, one set of rules for American companies where they have to be completely transparent and everything that's going on, and then have Chinese companies come in and say, hey, we want money, but we don't want to tell you what we're doing.
The Trump administration is asking for structural changes in U.S.-China trade relations. Will the Communist Party agree to it?
In essence, you have a command economy that is controlled by the Communist Party, and they don't want to dismantle it because the most important thing to the Communist Party is that they stay in control.
Follow this logic, will we not have a trade deal in the end?
I don't believe we're going to have a trade deal.
Amidst the U.S.-China trade war, my interview with General Robert Spalding. He's served in senior positions of strategy and diplomacy within the Defense and State Departments for more than 26 years. He's also spent years in China and learned the Chinese language. Leading up to the Trump-Xi summit in Osaka, I asked him what's really at stake in the U.S.-China trade war. I'm Simone, and you are watching Zooming In. All right, General Spalding, very nice to see you again.
Good to be back.
Yes. So President Trump and President Xi are going to meet on Saturday to talk about U.S.-China trade. And there are all sorts of speculations on what could come out of that meeting. And I just want to know, in your opinion, what kind of outcome would be in America's best interest?
Well, certainly I believe that the President ought to stick on the path of increasing the tariffs and forcing a decoupling between the U.S. and the Chinese Communist Party. I don't know if that's what's going to happen. I think more likely we're going to see a delay in the imposition of the tariffs on the extra $300 billion. But over time, the Chinese aren't going to bargain. They're not going to change their structural integrity of the economy that they built. They're not going to, have fair and free trade. They just can't do it. The structure, the control structure in the country, the people that are affiliated with the state-owned enterprises, the ones that are in power that sit behind Xi Jinping and promote the Communist Party, they cannot accept a change in the structure within the country.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a very important factor in this whole thing. Say if China, President Trump is pushing for China to accept those structural changes. Say China accepts it. But in reality, they really can't do it, right? That means the demise of the Communist Party.
Right? And to accept essentially the reversal of what they've been doing over just the last few years. Over the last few years, they've been consolidating state-owned enterprises. They've been strengthening state-owned enterprises, not dismantling. So even though they have said in every 5-year plan since they joined the WTO that they were going to do reform and opening up, in fact, they have been reversing that process. And now the state-owned enterprises are absolutely the most powerful within the country. And if they're not a state-owned enterprise, then they're a so-called private company, but still with incredible ties to the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Communist Party. So in essence, you have a command economy that is controlled by the Communist Party, and they don't want to dismantle it because the most important thing to the Communist Party is that they stay in control. And they see that control of the economic levers of society the most important that they have, in addition to the military.
And this will lead to a very important question. Theoretically, if this is true, then the trade war can have an outcome that is satisfying to both parties, right?
Right. So if you can't have structural changes in the economy, that means any enforcement mechanism is unacceptable to the Chinese Communist Party. So if you can't have an enforcement mechanism on a trade agreement, in essence, you don't have a trade agreement. Now, we know through the WTO that they have not been able to get China to do really anything. And so it's not a different world in terms of what we've come to expect with regard to how the Chinese Communist Party deals with trade enforcement. It's just now, for the first time, the administration realizes that the only way to actually get the Communist Party to deal is to have teeth in the agreement. And if you don't have teeth in the agreement, you essentially have no agreement.
So, follow this logic, will we not have a trade deal in the end?
I don't believe we're going to have a trade deal. I think what we're going to have is a series of dialogues that seek to bridge the gap between the bid and the ask, to use a quote I just recently heard. The bid and the ask is getting wider. I think they're going to seek to have dialogue that attempts to portray the narrowing of the bid and the ask right up through the 2020 elections. But as I said, the Communist Party can't deal, so the only thing they can do is talk. That's it.
So Lighthizer and Mnuchin met with Liu He on Monday, and they expressed the hope to relaunch the trade talks with China after the Trump-Xi meeting, and expressing, maybe we can reach a deal in the end or something. So you are saying there's not going to be a trade deal in the end. And my question is, do you think the Trump administration will be okay with not having a trade deal in the end?
I think they're pursuing the U.S. national interest, the interests of the American people. And the interests of the American people really have not been served by this close personal relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. And so recognizing that and offering, which they've done, offering a more fair and reciprocal relationship to the Chinese Communist Party, I think is something completely fair. I wouldn't do it, but I understand their attempt to at least try. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party can't do it. Mnuchin said the agreement, it was 90% done. So in essence, what he's saying, you've built a car. The car is 90% complete. The only thing that we have to do is put wheels on it.
And?
No wheels, no car.
All right. Wall Street has been throwing some threats, warnings, and some of the Wall Street strategists are saying if the summit does not yield any positive, signs of a deal, but rather escalation of trade tensions, there could be a global recession 3 quarters from now.
Well, the indications are that is happening, but there are other factors involved. It's not necessarily just because of this trade issue with China that's causing that. The reason is that a lot of those supply chains are moving to other places already, and so it is inevitable that there's going to be some adjustment. But I think in the long run, it's better for America and other democracies that they have a more stable, fair, reciprocal trading environment, not to mention in financial, in overall economic prosperity, and just in freedom, and freedom from economic coercion, which essentially, ever since 2012 and the rise of Xi Jinping, China has been forcing their interests in more and more of the globe.
After the Trump-Xi meeting, if things don't go well, there's no deal or signs of a deal, do you think President Trump will raise the tariffs right off?
Eventually, they're going to say enough is enough. I think, though, what they're trying to do is continue to portray confidence to the markets so that the markets aren't spooked, continue to portray confidence to American businesses. I think what needs to happen, and what hasn't happened yet, is the second part of what's in the national security strategy, which is investment in infrastructure, investment in research and development, investment in our own economy to help. The supply chain is moving. It's moving mostly to Southeast Asia and other countries. Some of it could move back to the United States, but it needs to be encouraged by a pro-U.S. investment policy by the administration. And I think that's the piece that is probably yet to come.
I was wondering what's going to happen to Wall Street with those tightening of...
What I'm trying to do, and this is just a part of what I do. What I'm trying to do is show, these people on Wall Street that they can invest here in the United States. We have the lowest energy costs in the world. We have some of the lowest corporate tax rates. We have a lot of deregulation. You can actually build businesses here. When I went to Taiwan, I want to talk to like Giant, right? The biggest bicycle manufacturer in the world. You can manufacture bicycles here. It's profitable because of all the structural changes, all the things that were happening in the past that made it the high labor costs, the high energy costs, all of those things that made it uneconomic to do manufacturing in the United States. They're all gone away. And if we build this secure nationwide 5G network, it's going to be the place to be for advanced manufacturing. So I think my goal is to form a partnership between us and our allies like Taiwan and Japan and South Korea and other countries that want this close relationship with the United States, both in terms of security and economics, and then bring some of the investment here to rebuild some of the industrial capacity of the United States. I think that's totally doable. That's why I got out of the military, is to work on that. Because I thought if I did that, then we could heal our country, we could put our people back to work. But more importantly, in doing so, we would make our democracy stronger, and then we could serve as a beacon to other nations that wanted to have democracy, to include the people of China.
Coming up, America is fighting to keep China from dominating the world's next generation of cyberspace. Can this be done by the U.S. alone? President Trump has indicated willingness to include the Huawei issue in the trade talk. Do you think it's a good idea?
No, because we've said the Huawei issue is not an economic issue, it's a national security issue. It's not a trade issue, it's a national security issue. There's an executive order based on a national security emergency. The entity list is only done for national security issues. And so I think bringing Huawei up in the context of a trade negotiation is deal with that national security issue. Now, the challenge is that we don't want Huawei in our networks here in the United States. And so there may be an argument to say, well, let's let other countries decide on their own whether we do that, in which case, we can stop, with Huawei being on the entity list. The challenge with that, though, is that somehow we need to convince these other nations, these other democracies, particularly ones that we have a security alliance with, that we share intelligence information with, that having Huawei in their networks makes it increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for us to continue those relationships. And so one of the ways that you do that is by continuing to keep Huawei on the entity list. They are a national security issue. The entity list is for national security problems. So I don't think Huawei is coming off the entity list, but I don't speak for the administration, so we'll see.
The interesting thing is, Huawei has received some heavy blows from America recently. Google and Facebook cut Huawei off, and Huawei is also on the blacklist from the Commerce Department to receive American equipment. However, Huawei is still signing up more 5G customers around the world. So the question is, if the rest of the world doesn't get on board, do you think America alone can stop Huawei?
Well, I think Huawei is going to be a smaller company either way. I think each country has to decide in its own way how it deals with the challenge of Huawei. I think what you'll see is you may see telcos sign agreements with Huawei. You may see countries not come out vocally and say they're not going to have Huawei equipment. But over time, what you're going to see is what actually gets installed probably won't be Huawei, because each of these countries has to deal with their own sovereignty and their own concerns about privacy and security. And so when you do that, when you look at the fact that not, the British Telecom, which has, a long-term partnership with Huawei, there's a study done in the UK saying that many of the security flaws that they brought up to Huawei are still in the gear, not to mention the fact that each change that comes out has more security flaws in it. There's recently another report coming out about all the security flaws that the Huawei gear has. I think over time, as people realize how important data is to their functioning of their economies and their societies, and certainly the free functioning of their societies, then they're going to realize that even if you can't come to the conclusion that Huawei is controlled by the Communist Party, which it is, that you at least know that the Huawei gear is the least secure of anything on the market today. Regardless of how it performs, it's the least secure. And I think as going forward, and this is what we wrote in the National Security Strategy, data security is going to be the most important thing for nations to do, as data is a strategic resource in the 21st century.
So you think the security concerns will eventually overpower the heavy lobby for Huawei?
Yeah, it's very much like the airplane. The airplane was scoffed at up until Billy Mitchell, sunk a German destroyer. Mm-hmm. And over time, the realization of how important the airplane was to warfare, now has, transformed the way war in that sense, in the kinetic sense, is conducted. In the same way, there were some that realized that networks very, very early on were going to be very important to warfare. And, as we see the proliferation of these 5G networks and their integration with machines, because it's a network for machines, people are waking up to the fact that the network is probably going to be the most important thing that you use to both protect your nation and preserve your democracy.
Huawei recently signed up Russia for 5G. What do you make of it?
Well, again, I think all of these political statements and posturing in public, I don't put much credence into. I'd like to see, 5 years down the road, how much Huawei equipment is actually in place in Russia. I don't know if you remember, but when President Trump went to Beijing, they had, something like $250 billion of announced deals. Go back and check how many of those deals actually came true. So there's frequent posturing, particularly by the Russians and the Chinese, to say we're going to do this or we're going to do that. But if you go back and check, usually most of them never actually happen.
So Russia has a backup plan?
I think Russia's backup plan is they've been, recently exercising how to disconnect completely from the internet. So, I guess that in the end it could just, unplug itself from the world and therefore protect itself from Huawei. But I don't think Russia is going to have a full partnership with Huawei. I would have bet that you're going to see Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung equipment there, as each of those provides a more secure foundation.
In Russia?
In Russia.
Coming up, hundreds of Chinese companies that pose national security threat to America or have violated human rights are being traded on the U.S. capital market. What does this mean, and will it be changed? Roger Robinson is an expert on financial security. He was President Ronald Reagan's senior NSC director for international economic affairs and played an important role in executing the Reagan strategy that ultimately brought down the Soviet Union. As chairman of the Prague Security Studies Institute in the Czech Republic, he recently described the extent and enormous strategic implications of Communist China's penetration into U.S. and other Western capital markets.
So, when we look at the number of companies that are in our capital markets today that are Chinese, we find that over 650 such enterprises are there. They're probably around 86 in the New York Stock Exchange, 62 in NASDAQ, and over 500 in the over-the-counter market. which is, as you know, the least regulated and the most popular for those seeking to skirt transparency and disclosure requirements. So here is a wide spectrum of companies. Many of them would be seen, politely put, as high-risk entities. Less politely put, are outright bad actors. And I'm talking about national security abusers of all stripe, as well as human rights abusers. And we can talk about some hard examples of this, but we're not, unfortunately, talking about a few tens of millions of dollars. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars and moving rapidly toward $1 trillion. Now, that's a lot of financing that's being attracted from unwitting American investors. How many people do we have in our country in the markets today? 180 million and 200 million Americans? I don't know the number, but you can appreciate that it's disturbingly high. And when you look at the pace at which the Chinese are coming into our markets for dollar financing, at which they're desperate for, you start to see a trend where trillions of dollars are going to flow into our markets over the next 2 to 3 years, to such an extent that it is conceivable that one morning the American people wake up and find, whether it's 12%, 15%, 17%, some high number of their investment portfolios or their retirement portfolios are Chinese securities. Well, guess what happens that day? The China lobby, as we know it today, appears to be a trivial asterisk next to what's coming. When, again, these folks realize that any American penalties or sanctions toward China, based on its malevolent behavior, could and probably would devalue or damage the value, another way to put it, of their retirement and pension systems.
You know, Roger Robertson has his research.
Yeah.
A lot of Chinese companies are on the U.S. capital market, and they are bad actors.
Right.
So, are there going to be legislation passed to stop that?
Absolutely, there has to be. You cannot have, one set of rules for American companies where they have to be completely transparent and everything that's going on, and then have the Chinese companies come in and say, "Hey, we want money, but we don't want to tell you what we're doing." I mean, anybody can see that that's crazy.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's not even, it's un-American even. The fact that we allowed it to happen, just indicates how confident we were in this free trade leads to wealth, wealth leads to democracy. Like, we were absolutely supremely confident that would happen. And all we had to do was open up and magic, and to the point where we let the Chinese basically just walk out with hundreds of billions of dollars.
Do you think the Wall Street will try to stop that? Try to stop this?
Yes,
kind of
because
legislation?
they're against it because they make fees on that. They don't care who they're whose stocks and bonds they're selling. They take a fee off the top. So you're basically cut into their fees when you say, hey, you can no longer sell Chinese stocks and bonds, right? So yeah, they're gonna disagree with it, right? They're gonna say, and they have said, oh, China's economy is gonna grow and it's the best place to invest. Meanwhile, everybody knows it's shrinking, except for the data that comes out of the Communist Party. So, I mean, you can see, like MSCI, the Emerging Markets Index. We're in the middle of a trade war, and it goes from 5 to 20%. How does that make any economic sense? Or how would you? So you would go to your portfolio advisor, and he says, well, we should get rid of all these stocks in Latin America and in Southeast Asia, and invest in Chinese stocks. And then you're sitting there thinking, yeah, but the companies are moving out of China to Southeast Asia. Why am I putting money in China? Well, because China told me to. I mean, it's just insane.
Okay, so that's going to happen.
It's going to happen.
That legislation.
Whether it's the legislation or the SEC steps in or Treasury steps in, that ability for China to basically tap into Western capital markets and just get as much money as they need, that's going away.
Yeah. So how soon do you think it will happen? Because
not soon enough.
Okay.
It needs to happen now. I mean, I don't know. The longer we go, the more harm eventually comes to Americans and their retirement funds. So.
Yeah.
But again, what do we have? What's the problem we have here? We have this, election coming up. Everything's hard in an election year.
Yes. Yes. All right. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much, General.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.